Hello, my name is Mike Petro, Executive Vice President of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board, or CED, and welcome to Policy Watch. Policy Watch is a webcast series designed to connect business leaders to the public policy issues of the day. Now, today we will discuss how business can sustain capitalism. We plan to highlight various chapters of a book CED released in 2017 titled Sustaining Capitalism, Bipartisan Solutions to Restore Trust and Prosperity. Issues to be discussed today are trade, immigration, education policy, and debts and deficits. Now, some of the key questions that will be addressed today are: how can employees in the private sector help fix capitalism independent of policymakers with their companies? What are the top economic and educational issues facing capitalism? And in what way will these issues play a role in the upcoming 2018 midterm elections? And finally, how can business leaders apply their business acumen to gain more value in capitalism? So our discussion will focus on how these issues impact our economy and how sound policy in these areas can restore trust in capitalism. Now, before we begin our show, let me tell you a little bit about CED and our history. CED is a center of the Conference Board. We are comprised of some 180 CEOs from across the country. CED was formed in the 1940s when President Roosevelt was holding discussions about how to move the U.S. from a wartime to a peacetime economy. In fact, CED's very first policy study became the blueprint for the Marshall Plan. So, in fact, in addition to that, Paul Hoffman, who was our first chairman, became the first administrator of the Marshall Plan. So for 7 decades, CED's business leaders have provided reasoned solutions in the nation's interest. And CED has impacted several issues across the board over our decades, including education policy, healthcare reform, money and politics, fiscal policy, and other pressing issues of the day. Now, before we get started with our program, I have a few housekeeping items that I'll need to cover, and then we'll do the intros and we'll get into the meat of our show. The first is, how to participate in today's webcast. First, we want you to ask questions as they occur via the chat box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. We will weave those questions into the conversation and may follow up with an email if any of the questions are left after the hour presentation. Feel free to download the presentation via the file download pod in the bottom center of your screen, and you may full screen the video, PPT, at any time by clicking the 4 arrows at the top and right of the screen. And then finally, complete the brief evaluation at the end so that we can incorporate your feedback for future webcast presentations. In addition, you can earn CPE credits. Type your full name and email address in the space provided. Click OK for the 3 pop-ups that occur during the program. Stay on for the entire webcast, that's important, and credit is for live participation only. Now, today's Policy Watch, as mentioned, is about business and how it can sustain capitalism. And our guests are Mike Archibald. Mike is the former CEO of GNC Holdings. In addition to his role as CEO of GNC, Mike served as the CEO of Talbot's and CFO of AutoZone. Mike is a co-chair to CED's Sustainable Capitalism Subcommittee, and I might add, a valuable contributor to our Sustainable Capitalism book. In addition to Mike, we have Dr. Joseph Minerick, the Senior Vice President at CED. Joe is our Director of Research here, and Joe is the co-author of CED's Sustaining Capitalism book and has an impressive resume, serving as the Chief Economist of the Office of Management and Budget during the Clinton years, and also the Chief Economist of the House Budget Committee. Welcome, gentlemen, to the webcast.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
Great. So a couple of things from the start. We're going to dissect areas of the book into trade, immigration, education, and fiscal policy. And at the front end of each discussion, we're going to poll the audience on their views about aspects of those particular issues. But let me just for a second talk a little bit about our book, Sustaining Capitalism, and why we decided to issue that book and release it in 2017. First of all, it was the 75th anniversary of CED, and we felt like it was important that we compile some of the studies we've done throughout the decades and update those studies and synthesize them into a volume to have a conversation across America about the importance of the future of capitalism. We recognize as business leaders that capitalism is critically important to the world. We believe that it has brought people out of poverty. It's helped create a middle class, and as business leaders are obviously very pro-capitalist. But we also recognize that there needs to be improvements along the way, and we recognize that there's a declining trust in capitalism around some segments of the population. So this book, in addition to trumpeting the values of capitalism, also attempted to go out and see where we can improve and how we could bring more people together in this country to reap the benefits of capitalism. And I think that book did so effectively. So let's switch the discussion now to trade policy. U.S. trade continues to be a lightning rod politically in this country. Americans seem to be evenly split on the steel and aluminum tariffs that were announced. In March, 78% of the Republicans support the tariffs, 74% of Democrats oppose them. But that's obviously been something that's been on the radar screen, and I want to talk to our guests about that and also about NAFTA and the importance of keeping NAFTA and what that means for business. But, the negotiations between NAFTA and Mexico and U.S. and Canada, that's been pulled back into the front burner here. So I want to talk about that as well. But let's kick off our discussion with a poll for the audience. And the first poll would be, will restricting imports create more jobs for American workers? And of course, the choices are yes, no, maybe, and don't know. So let me give you a second to answer that question, and then we'll go on to our discussion. It's always important to get the thinking of our audience. And it looks like 66% do not think that restricting imports will create more jobs for American workers, and 28% is yes. So that's interesting. Let me turn to my colleague, Joe Minerick, and get the questions and the interview started. Joe, who has the upper hand in the trade wars, the U.S. or China, and which country stands to lose more? I mean, you hear so much about China and the U.S. and the trade and the back and forth and how important that is to the economy. But who do you think has the upper hand?
There's a saying among people who work in the trade area that there really is no winner in a trade war. There are only losers. Economics tells us that folks are making voluntary exchanges. They buy the highest quality at the lowest price. And that is true of businesses as well as for consumers. So U.S. businesses, if they have the opportunity to buy inputs to their productive processes, are going to find a way to get the best deal. And when they do that, even if they're buying overseas, it means that the products they produce here in the U.S., and by the way, about 1/2 of what we import makes its way into U.S. products, which are sold either domestically or around the world. When you get that best deal, in your production process, you are more competitive. The same is true of producers overseas. So if we get to the point where we build a wall to protect U.S. producers, and as a result, other U.S. producers have to pay higher prices for components for the goods that they produce, at the end of the day, the United States economy will be less competitive, will generate less value. The same will be true for producers overseas. And as a result of that, really, we are all going to be poorer, not only the United States and China, but other countries around the world. They may take opportunities to fill in for what we're producing. But the reason why we're now doing business with China is because we can get a better China and they can get a better deal from us in terms of value. And so value worldwide is going to go down if we have a trade war. Everybody will lose.
Right. So we know there's a trade deficit between the United States and China. Does that necessarily spell bad news for the U.S. economy? I mean, can you clarify the longtime concern for our audience about that?
We've got more than two countries in this world. It is very much to be expected that country A will buy from country B, and country B will buy from country C. You may have bilateral deficits. At the end of the day, you ought to have an overall balance in trade, you would expect. There will always be differences in performance between developing countries and developed countries. The United States right now is something of an outlier. We have an overall trade deficit, even though as a developed country you'd expect that we would be producing for the rest of the world. In many lines of business we are. We're a big exporter in agriculture, for example. But part of the issue for the United States, really the heart of the issue if you're talking to economists, is that we run an overall trade deficit of which the Chinese deficit is a part, but not all. We run an overall trade deficit simply because we are consuming too much and saving too little. And as a result of that, we're buying things from the rest of the world that we can't produce. And to do that, we are running a trade deficit and we are borrowing from the rest of the world. If we straightened out our overall fiscal situation, we would, and if we as a nation saved more, that trade deficit would go away, not necessarily with every individual country, but putting them all together. And trade deficits with individual countries are certainly to be expected.
Right. All right, so let's turn to Mike Archibald and get a business perspective on this issue. How do you see this issue, Mike, through a business lens?
So thanks, Mike. So it's interesting, and just to piggyback on the audience poll question, it's interesting that about 1 out of 4 has said that restricting imports would create jobs. And you know, as a business person, the answer is for some it would, but I think to Joe's point, overall is what we need to focus on from an economic perspective, from the entire economy. It would not be creating jobs. So obviously, if you're in one industry that gets some protection, that might be saving jobs, but it is not the right thing for the economy. So, you know, back to the overall business perspective, the concept of free and fair trade is such a basic tenet of capitalism. And business leaders, and you know, I as well as most business leaders, strongly, enthusiastically support free and fair trade. In fact, it's the embodiment of the principle that we are free as a people, as companies, or as a nation to purchase the production of our goods and services, or buy and sell the production of our goods and services with each other based solely on our independent valuation. And that is really important because it is that independent valuation. And any interruption in that value chain is really not welcome. They are not welcome participators at the table for the conversation, the table for negotiation. Tariffs are one form of that interruption and therefore are not welcome. But it's important to know that there are a number of unwelcome guests at this table. Other unwelcome guests at this table would include situations where companies are able to run unlimited losses with government-controlled entities that have virtually inexhaustible resources. On top of that, you have situations where there is theft of intellectual property or forced technology transfer. None of these elements are welcome elements at this proverbial table of free trade. And it's important that they are all addressed in the process here. I think that, maybe I hope, but I do also believe that right now what we're experiencing is not hopefully the beginning of a trade war, but probably the beginning of a hard-fought negotiation. So connecting this back to the book about sustaining capitalism and the trends that we've seen about sustaining capitalism, I think it's really interesting to note that over the past 3 decades, the World Bank has said that China has lifted approximately 800 million of its citizens out of poverty. An absolutely amazing progress. In fact, they have almost single-handedly reduced the world poverty rate by 75%. So an amazing feat. But it's important to note that not an inconsequential part of that improvement has been done through China focusing on moving towards a market-based economy. Specifically, things like market-based reforms and other things like their special enterprise zones that they have created have all contributed to lifting the population out of poverty. I find it very interesting that when President Trump has announced his intention to implement some tariffs, largely based upon some unfair practices, as we spoke of course, China retaliated or said that they would retaliate in kind. But in addition, I found it very interesting that President Xi at the Boao conference actually came out and said that his commitment was to further reducing tariffs and further opening up his markets. Well, back to that table of negotiation, I think it's rather interesting that when your counterparty at this table of negotiation is doing an incredible job of emphatically and well supporting your position, I think that's nothing short of a victory lap for capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That's an interesting thought. Let's talk a little bit about, gentlemen, for the audience, a little bit about the politics. And I'm sitting next to Joe Minerick, who has spent so many years on Capitol Hill working the politics and the policy of all this. Now, traditionally, free markets and things like NAFTA, those have been issues heralded by Republicans. And I remember when NAFTA was passed during the Clinton years, it was the labor groups that were most concerned about that labor wing of the Democratic Party. But now there seems to be kind of an ideological shift here going on, Joe. Don't you think? It seems like, you've got a Republican president who's, pushing some of these reforms. And talk to me a little bit about the politics and how that's changed over time.
We're really in a state now where the extremes of the political spectrum on both ends have pretty much come to an agreement that they are negative on the value of trade. You have both extreme Democrats and extreme Republicans arguing that the elites, the corporate interests, are attempting to increase their profits by cutting out the U.S. worker and moving jobs overseas. And therefore, the argument is trade is a bad thing. On the other hand, you have the economists, we're outnumbered, and many other Americans, particularly in the business community, who recognize that if they are to produce competitively, if they are to export we need to be willing to import as well, and we need to be willing to follow the paths where we are most productive and take advantage of them. So at the end of the day, this is an energizing issue, but it really seems to be an energizing issue for both ideological extremes. Who wins that tug of war, I think, is impossible to call.
Right. I mean, you've got, and certainly, Mike, from your end, as a business leader, you've been used to perhaps maybe some of the opposition has come from the left of the political spectrum on these issues, and now it's a little murkier these days, isn't it?
It is, absolutely, and the polarization that we are seeing amongst the parties is really incredible. But I think it's incumbent upon business leaders to then come back and really support our elected leaders and let them know that our expectation is that they'll come to an agreement, that there needs to be a negotiated stance, that we can't just continue to keep polarizing these issues. And I think it's incumbent upon business leaders to make that case very strongly.
Right. So, Joe, the crystal ball, do you think this issue on trade becomes a factor in the 2018 midterm elections, or do you think it's a little beyond people's radar screens?
Well, I suspect that there will be some people who will rush to the polls on election day on this issue, but some of them are going to be wearing red shirts and some of them are going to be wearing blue shirts. And where that balance comes out, I think, is almost impossible to call.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to turn to our next topic, which is another polarizing issue, immigration policy. And immigration travel ban before the Supreme Court just occurred, and the tight labor market, both now and over the next decade, reinforces the need for us to have real solid immigration reform. But before we get into that discussion, let me poll the audience yet again. Should immigration be increased, decreased, or kept at present levels? First answer being increased, decreased, no change, or don't know, or no response. Let's see what the audience has to say. So it says, it looks like a little bit leaning toward increased, if I'm reading that correctly, and actually about a 50-50 split with no change. So that's very interesting.
But nobody's saying decrease.
Nobody's saying decrease. Interesting. Yeah. So, Joe Minerick, are there any immigration proposals out there right now that you think could garner bipartisan support?
There are ideas that are supported by people from both parties. The difficulty in terms of making policy is that you cannot, so far as based on the most recent round of run at this issue in the Senate, you can't get 60 votes. The results that occurred in the course of that Senate debate really do seem to show a tremendous amount of not only ideological opposition between the two parties, but also substantial division within the parties, particularly in the Senate within the Republican Party. The issues that are on the table, it's really a smorgasbord, and the problem that the Senate has in trying to take action is trying to find a way to get the right mixture to get to those 60 votes in this highly polarized environment. On the two extremes of the issue continuum, on the one hand, you have the dreamers. What do we do with young people who are brought into this country under circumstances that were beyond their control, who have played by the rules, for whom the United States is the only real home that they have ever known? And there are those who really insist that that population be taken care of, be allowed to stay in this country, have a path to citizenship. On the other issue extreme, we've got the wall. And there are those on the other side of this issue who will not go along with any concession toward the dreamers without getting the wall that they want. And then in the middle, we've got some other issues. We have the issue of family unification. There are those who are definitely opposed to the notion that individuals are nationalized, who have a route to citizenship, should have the opportunity to bring family members into the country from overseas. There are those who are opposed to the so-called diversity lottery in the current system. And there are others who are strongly in favor of a so-called skill-based immigration system, that we ought to look at skills in this country that are in short supply and give preference to folks from overseas who have those skills. Currently, we have a system that focuses on people who have bachelor's degrees and want to work in fields where bachelor's degrees are required. We have a significant shortage, to cite just one example, in the field of nursing. Nursing does not necessarily require a bachelor's degree. So our system ignores the need of the U.S. economy for more nurses. And that need is growing very rapidly as we baby boomers are aging and are coming of need of medical services. So you have to try to find a way to look at all of those issues and find a balance. And when you have folks at the two extremes who say absolute concessions to the dreamers, or on the other hand, build a wall, it's very hard to build that consensus. And so right now, we have not been able to put together a compromise that will get you to those 60 votes in the Senate that you need to do anything.
Right. And, and it's very clear that once again, it seems like the extremes are dominating the debate here. And I would turn to Mike Archibald, the business leader, and give his business perspective, which has always been, business leaders are out there, Mike, as you know, trying to find well-qualified people to fill these jobs. They've been traditionally supportive of visas from people throughout the country. We have a labor shortage that's of concern for the economy. Give us your thoughts about the immigration debate and how critically important it is to business.
So you're right. So just to build on what you were saying there, Mike, has become such a polarizing issue, and where so many people see problems. As a business leader, not only do I see opportunity, I truly see solutions. They really are solutions to a lot of the problems that we are currently experiencing in America. So if we look at this as a business, if all of a sudden we make America Inc., right? All of a sudden we need to grow our business, also known as the economy, right? And we need to do that for several reasons, because the growth in the economy is one of the critical things that will help us to be able to reduce our deficits and our debt. And in addition, we need an incremental inflow into our labor force. We need those incremental folks. As Joe mentioned, we have a disproportionate number of folks entering the workforce versus retiring. So we've got the baby boomers, which is creating a dramatic imbalance in our entitlements. So we need things that can put those things back together and actually help. Yet, when we look at the tools that we've got to be able to do that, it's very difficult. We're sitting now at or near full employment. So our ability to bring more people into the workforce is somewhat hampered. And we certainly have limited opportunity to meaningfully increase the productivity level of our employees throughout the country. So if we can't be doing those things, and then on top of that, we're now sitting with what will hopefully be somewhat of a repatriation windfall, where some of that money is going to wind up being invested in capital. So between the repatriation windfall and hopefully the lower marginal cost of taxation, It should spur some investment. Well, with that capital investment often comes a need for human capital. And once again, we don't have that human capital to be able to put where we need it. So I think that adding workers to the economy is actually a plus, just like free trade is a plus. It's actually an economic gain for us, and therefore it's something that we should be open to and our elected officials should be open to. I think it's interesting, the poll that you put up where you had 50% of the people say that we should increase it, and then another 50% said unchanged, whereas none indicated that it should go down. I think this is an interesting case of where the position of the electorate is very different than the position of the elected. And therefore, we need to stand up and be counted and lay out what needs to happen. Now that's to your point, Mike, and Joe, there's a lot of open questions. Should there be a guest worker program? And if there's a guest worker program, what should be the renewal rate? And if we do it, is there a path to citizenship? And will these folks be eligible for our social services? And to Joe's point, should we be targeting certain ages, certain education levels, or certain occupations? And of course, there's the security issue associated with the wall. As a business person, I would just say we need to do something in order to be able to help drive the economy. There's a compromise out there to be made. And once again, I believe that our business leaders need to stand up and be counted and let our elected officials know that we expect them to do their job, we expect them to come to a compromise, and we expect them to come up with a solution.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. I don't know who this question's for, but I'll pose it to both of you. Clearly when this issue is debated around the country, there's a segment of the population that says, hey, they're stealing my job. That was my job that was taken by an immigrant or an illegal immigrant. Maybe Joe, for you first, how do you square that? I mean, is that really the case? Are we really taking jobs away from qualified Americans who live in this country and pay taxes and replacing those people with immigrant, perhaps illegal immigrants?
Well, I'm going to go back to what Mike said a moment ago with respect to trade. Mm-hmm. If you want to go through the country and look and find someone who is in an inferior competitive position and has lost a job because of immigration, you'll be able to find that guy. And you'll be able to find a number of them. There are, however, some broad answers to that question that on balance tell you that that situation is more the exception than it is the rule. We have a number of immigrants at the low end of the skill level who are doing jobs that Americans, Native Americans, by and large, don't want to do. Mm-hmm. In agriculture, that is, the quintessential example. U.S. workers do not queue up for jobs working in the fields, picking strawberries. Immigrant workers are willing to do that. And among the devices that have been used in public policy in recent years have been so-called guest worker permits, so that individuals can come into the country, do those jobs, but then leave when the time period for those jobs is gone. The second point follows from something that Mike said a moment ago, which is that this economy is very close to what we call full employment. And if you look across the economy, there are jobs where we are not producing enough workers to be able to fill those jobs. I mentioned nursing before. It is a quintessential example. It really does slap you in the face. There are other examples that where we could point to them, including very highly mathematically oriented jobs in the computing industry with respect to big data, highly sophisticated statistical skills. We can employ everybody in this country who gains those skills and still be short. And if we have folks coming into the country and doing those jobs, by definition, they are not stealing jobs from anybody else because we don't have enough people to do those jobs. So if you look for situations where immigration does step on native-born American workers' toes and take their jobs, yes, they do exist. What we need to do is to help those native-born American workers and at the same time fill the jobs that are now vacant, because, as Mike pointed out, we need to have an economy that is growing rapidly to meet our own obligations, to take care of our budget deficit, and to take care of our retiring, growing elderly population.
Great. So on the crystal ball front, I mean, who's gonna be more inclined to go to the polls in record numbers or increased numbers? The people who support the wall, or the people who support the Dreamers' reform?
Do you have a point? I don't know any other way to answer that question.
Right. I think they're both inspired because of their passion for.
Yeah, I would not give you a better answer than a good silver dollar would.
Okay. Alrighty. So let's switch to education policy. CED has been working in the area of education reform for decades. We have traditionally seen education as business leaders, other consumers of the system that we have in our country for educating our young people, but also for our adults and people who want to go turn back to work. CED is engaged in the very earliest years of early childhood education, K-12, and of course post-secondary, which includes credentials of all different kinds and adult learning. So Congress is in the process of reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, which governs U.S. higher education policy. And as the economy puts a bigger and bigger premium on knowledge, developing effective higher education policies has never been more important for both employers and employees. So let's do another poll on education policy, and then we'll get to the questions to our guests. Which proposal would have the most impact on making college more affordable? First, make public colleges and universities free by having taxpayer fund tuition. Allow students to refinance their loans. Link students to private investors who would fund their education and allow students to pay investors back directly. None of the above or no response. Let's see what we've got here. Just looking at our screen here to see, and it looks like the number one answer is allow students to refinance their loans. Number two is making college free, and really none of the above. So interesting responses. So Joe, we see so many products drop in cost, but increase in quality. Why hasn't competition delivered that same economic punch to higher education? And is the price tag, it remains so high, yet innovation continues to progress at a snail's pace. Talk a little bit about the state of higher ed.
The markets in the United States where you see rapid technological change, which leads to improvements in quality and lower costs, or at the very least, maintaining relatively stable prices over a long period of time, are markets that do have a lot of competition. And competition has a number of characteristics. One thing is individuals can vote with their feet. They have good information. They can select a product that meets their needs. There's a lot of entry on the part of new sellers, so that if one company is taking advantage of its situation in a relative monopoly, other companies can get into the business and provide that competition. You look at education, particularly higher education, and it doesn't meet those conditions. If there is a particular automobile that is hot and everybody wants it, you can go to the dealer and maybe put your name on a waiting list, but you'll be able to get that automobile. Not everybody can go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. There are a lot of people who would be willing to pay the price, and the product simply is not available in a sufficient quantity. Another attribute here, which is very important, particularly when you're going away from the marquee universities, where if you can put that name behind your name, you know that it's going to give you a big jump in life. Look at a lot of the other universities that are not so highly uniquely identified. People don't really know what the benefit of that education is. There is very, very little information about the extent to which people who get university educations from particular institutions actually achieve. The universities do not keep data like that available. There's nobody who connects the information about students today with their future incomes and whether they are getting jobs in the fields for which they were educated. So really, to a considerable degree, we're flying blind when we go to educational institutions and sign on the dotted line to send our children there. We don't know, in many instances, anywhere near to the degree that we understand in typical product markets, competitive markets, what it really is that we're buying. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, you don't have the kind of pressure on the producers, the sellers, to hold prices down and at the same time to improve quality. You don't have the ability to employ new technology to the degree that we can in many other fields. When we're producing products, we've got robots who have been able to work with great precision without getting tired, and oftentimes at lower cost than manual labor. At the same time, we do have online educational institutions, but to some degree, it has been a matter of question when an employer looks at that degree for a particular individual. What is that degree? What does that degree stand for? If an individual has gone to a marquee university, you assume that there has been the laying on of hands, that that individual has been monitored carefully through a 4-year process. And the institution stands behind the achievement of that individual in completing a degree. When you're looking at many of the newer, more technologically innovative institutions, we still haven't really come to the point where we have the same degree of confidence of what those degrees are worth. We need to find a way to make sure that those kinds of innovations can be followed, and at the same time, we can have a guarantee of quality in the achievement of those degrees. And if we get there, there is the opportunity for technological progress that may be able to hold down price while maintaining quality.
So Mike Archibald, on the business side of the equation, obviously business leaders are, as I mentioned, companies or consumers of the education system. Give us a sense as to how this has impacted you. And also, we all know that there are online institutions that do terrific things, and in fact, that might be the wave of the future. But we also know that some of them are more challenged. I don't know, Mike, if you have a perspective on that as well. But give us the business view.
Sure. So there's a lot there to talk about, Mike, and it is critical from a business perspective because businesses are the ultimate consumers of the education process and the product. But it's certainly not new. I mean, it goes back over 2 millennia ago. Plato cited there are only two things that matter. One is who gets to teach the children, and what do we teach them? So here we are 2 millennia later, still trying to figure out exactly what to do there. But to bring it to more current, I think it's interesting that very recently the National Assessment of Educational Progress results just came out for the 2017 tests. And unfortunately, it showed little, if any, improvement. In fact, for the 4th and 8th graders that took the tests throughout the United States, over the last 10 years, there's been very little, if any, progress. And that's certainly not for lack of funding, because we've certainly been able to put resources to bear on this, but it hasn't produced the fruit. So I think it's interesting, because if I take it from a business perspective, while one of the concepts is education being there and being necessary to support capitalism, I think we can also flip it the other way and say, I think there's an opportunity for capitalism to actually help improve the education system. So whether it's things like experimentations within a free market system where parents are free to choose where to send their children, and maybe there's a voucher system, there are a number of different possibilities that can be looked at. I think it's also important, looking at it from a business perspective, that we measure the results. So we need to be focused on outcomes, not just outputs. Very often we hear about how many kids are graduating. Well, that's not really the metric, because we're not making them either career ready or college ready out of these schools. You'll notice I'm actually focusing a lot on the K-12 side as opposed to the higher ed side, mostly just because I think it's where we need to begin. If someone ever says, where should we begin? I say, well, at the beginning, of course. Well, so we should begin with the K-12 to try and make some improvements there. And again, focusing on the outputs and not the outcomes. And back to what can business leaders do? They can get involved. There's lots of places to get involved, whether you focus on the different opportunities for experimentation, whether you actually focus on the standards, whether they be the career-ready standards or the college-ready standards, or you can focus on the curriculum, or you can focus on vouchers if that's what you want to support, or school choice. There are so many opportunities that we have to improve our education system and use the capital market concept, the concept of capitalism, to improve our education system.
Great. Great. Okay, so we're going to switch our gears here to a lovely topic of debts and deficits. The Congressional Budget Office's recent projection made headlines. Joe Minerick, you'll appreciate this. $1 trillion deficits are returning sooner than formerly thought, 2020 versus 2022. Let's poll the audience on debts and deficits. Should the federal government have a spending cap that prevents it from spending more than it takes in during a given year? Agree, disagree, neither, agree or disagree, or don't know? So it looks like most people agree that there should be a cap that prevents the government from taking in more in a given year than going out. And Joe Minerick, what do you think of those results, first of all?
I would love to see how he would enforce it. If we ought to talk a little bit, I think, about where the problem is coming from.
Right. I mean, what's making this occur?
In the long term, the problem is healthcare. Very simply put. People sometimes say that the problem is entitlements. The problem with entitlements is health care, even more so than Social Security, which back in the old days, we all said that when the baby boomers start to retire, Social Security was going to eat us alive. Turns out it's much more Medicare than it is Social Security. we have a very hard time figuring out how to control healthcare spending without harming the quality of healthcare that our seniors receive. Healthcare is getting expensive year to year, and we have more seniors. And you multiply those two together, and it causes a serious budgetary problem. A cap that would try to control spending on healthcare raises some very interesting questions. If the fiscal year you get into early September and healthcare spending is too high and is causing a budget deficit, you start pulling people out of operating rooms where they're undergoing surgery under Medicare. Can't do that. So we really need to try to find a way to address the healthcare problem, understanding how hard that is going to be. The healthcare system is, healthcare spending in the United States is something in the range of 17 to 18% of our gross domestic product, which makes healthcare, the healthcare industry in the United States, approximately the size of the economy of France. It is a very, very big boat, and it is going to be very, very hard to turn it around in a hurry, which means that we're going to have to find savings elsewhere in the budget to keep our debt from piling up as rapidly as the Congressional Budget Office said it's going to. And if we're on the path where CBO says we are, we're sunk. That path is not sustainable. It has the cost of servicing our debt and the size of our debt growing faster than our economy is. And that can't go on forever, very obviously. We've got to turn those curves around.
So, Joe, you were involved in the diminishing Rivlin deficit reduction task force, bipartisan efforts, and one of those. Both of those efforts actually showed promise, real promise. What went wrong there, and why didn't we really kind of...
The problem with reducing the budget deficit is that all of the options, you're either reducing spending or you're raising taxes. Don't have to tell you what raising taxes is like, either in the real world or in political terms. Cutting spending. People sometimes forget every dollar of spending is somebody's income. Every dollar of spending was put in the budget because a majority of the Congress wanted it there, and the president was willing to sign the bill that authorized it. And going forward, people that spending in the budget are going to try to protect it. It is much harder to pull something out than it is to put it in. And then you get to the point where the question is, which of these painful decisions make, especially when you're talking about a problem that is by its nature a long-term problem. We have members of Congress whose field of vision is limited to 2 years. I'm up for election in 2 years. Even senators, the field of vision can be as long as 6 years at most. And if you're telling those folks that you've got a 20-year problem, and if you want to solve the problem, you've got to give people some very, very bad news. The instinct on the part of every elected policymaker is later. I don't want to deal with it now. I want to deal with it later. It makes it very hard to take action on that kind of a problem, even though it is intensely in the interest of every American to try to solve this problem.
Right. So, Mike Archibald, I'm going to have you address the deficit question from a business lens, but then I'd appreciate it if you would then segue to sort of a call to action, because we're coming to the close of this discussion, and I think it's important to hear from business as to what business leaders can do to, help solve some of these problems and help get it to Mike?
Sure. So thanks, Mike. So just to build on some of the things that Joe said, I think it is critically important that we address our deficits and our debt in the nearer term. We know that it's going to come to be a problem at some point in the future. We don't know exactly when, because you don't know when the psyche of the collective wisdom of the market will cause us to pay the price. But as a business leader, it's important that we address it now, and that's what businesses do. They address it when they recognize a problem, not when it becomes a crisis. And to do that, we would need to be able to address both the revenues as well as the expense side. And I think Joe's done a great job of laying out the different possibilities on the revenue and the expense side. So to the point of, there's been a number of different plans out there, Mike, that you mentioned, whether it's Simpson-Bowles or Domenici-Revlin. CED has a wonderful proposal that's out there, and I applaud them for doing that. I think the business leaders have to get behind this. I think they should pick one, or better yet, they should not pick one, because it creates too much us versus them kind of thinking, unfortunately, in this environment. But what they should do is, again, mandate that this be addressed, that there be a compromise. We can go back to the idea of yet another super committee or whatever it takes, but we have to get our elected officials to do what they were elected to do, to be the leaders. Unfortunately, too often we elect leaders and we send them to Washington and they become politicians. And that can't continue anymore. We need the leadership. We need to address this, because this is a very real, very significant problem that's coming at us. To your point around a call to action, Mike, I think it was Calvin Coolidge who said the business of America is business. And I think that as business leaders, it is really a compulsion upon us to stand up and be counted. And I recognize that sometimes for business leaders, that's a difficult thing to do, because it's sometimes stepping into the world of politics when you're also trying to run a business. Well, it's much easier if you address it from purely a business and economics perspective. So I would encourage our business leaders to get involved. There continues to be big opportunities, whether you want to, of course, stand up for free trade, or find one of the many ways to get involved in education, or whether it's to literally just come out about the deficits, or whether you want to focus on trade. These are all things that are necessary for us to be able to improve our economy. And we need our business leaders to step up and be counted. I think it's important to note in this process that we are very privileged. We get to sit here in this wonderful country where we get to criticize and focus on all of the things that are wrong and try and come up with the solutions. That is a privilege that is not shared through much of the world. So it is a privilege to be here, and with that comes the responsibility for leaders to lead. So again, I call upon business leaders, because leadership in this case is not a position, it's not a title. Leadership is a choice, and I ask for our business leaders to stand up and lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike Archibald, Joe Minerick. We're about ready to close out our program. I think it's, when I started at the very beginning talking about CED and how we became the inspiration for the Marshall Plan, it's really that kind of leadership that will be needed in the coming years from CEOs, that sort of the business champions, if you will, who can provide the leadership that's needed, because there's so much intransigence and polarization here in Washington, but business leaders can make a real difference. So Mike Archibald, Joe Minerick, thank you for being here. Thanks to our participants for being a part of today's webcast. Join us for our next Policy Watch on September the 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern, and you can visit our website and register for that webcast as well. So for today, I'd like to say thanks again, and have a good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you.